Blurb. Henry is a sturdy farm horse with a big problem. His hooves hurt. His friends Barnaby the carriage horse and Woolly the sheep try to help, but Henry just can't keep plowing the fields. Join Henry and old John as they try to discover the reason behind Henry's aching feet. Henry Horse's Hooves Hurt by Rrocket White. The straw in Henry's stall was soft enough, and the morning sun streamed through the cracks in the stable walls, painting stripes of light across his brown coat. But Henry, a sturdy farm horse with a kind eye, shifted his weight from one aching hoof to the other. A sigh heavy as a sack of oats escaped his nostrils. Another morning. Another set of throbbing feet, he murmured to Barnaby, a tall gray gelding in the next stall. Barnaby, who spent most of his days pulling a light carriage on smooth roads, flicked an ear back. Have you tried soaking them, Henry? Old John sometimes soaks my legs after a long journey. Feels right good. Henry sighed again. Soak them, Barnaby. For hours. Old John even added some special herbs Mrs. Gable from down the lane recommended. Didn't do a lick of good. From the other side, Daisy, a younger mare known for her spirited canters in the pasture, chimed in. Maybe it's your shoes, Henry? Old John's been trying all sorts, hasn't he? Perhaps they're too small? Too small, too loose, leather, iron. Even those funny rubber ones for a bit. Henry recounted, his voice weary. We've been through a whole stack of 'em, Daisy. My feet just ache all the time. Just then the stable door creaked open, letting in a rectangle of bright morning light, and in stepped old John. He was a man with a kind face, weathered by years of sun and wind, and eyes that held a quiet understanding. He walked straight to Henry's stall, his boots making soft thuds on the packed earth. Old John reached over the stall door and gently patted Henry on the nose, his touch warm and familiar. Well, Henry, he said, his voice a low rumble that always made Henry feel a little calmer. How are you this morning? If old John could understand horse talk, he would have heard Henry's whicker as, My feet hurt, old John. This is going to be a long day for me, I know it. But don't you worry, I'll do whatever I can for you. I won't give up. Old John, of course, heard only the soft, familiar sound, but his eyes seemed to read the weariness in Henry's posture. He ran a hand down Henry's strong neck, feeling the warmth of his hide. Still bothering you, eh, old boy? He murmured, his brow furrowing slightly. We'll figure something out, Henry, always do. Just then old John knelt down, running a practiced hand over Henry's lower leg, then carefully lifting a hoof. He examined the bottom of the hoof, not just the shoe, his brow furrowed in deep thought. He ran his hand over the packed earth floor of the stall, then the uneven stones just outside the stable door. He murmured, more to himself than to Henry. Always been a bit rough around here. He stood up, his eyes now sweeping across the stable, taking in every detail of the floor, the stalls, and the pathway leading outside. A slow, thoughtful look spread across his face, like dawn breaking over the hills. A spark of an idea seemed to light up old John's eyes. Without another word, he moved from Henry's stall to Barnaby's, then Daisy's, swiftly leading each horse out of the stables and into the sun-drenched pasture where they could graze freely. The horses watched him with curiosity, wondering what new notion had taken hold. Once the stables were empty, old John went straight to the tool shed. He emerged moments later, not with Henry's harness, but with a sturdy rake and a heavy, pointed pickaxe. With a determined look on his face, he stepped back into the stable. He didn't start with the stalls, but with the narrow path just inside the main door where the ground was most worn down. He began to rake the ground, pulling away loose straw and debris, revealing the hard, uneven earth beneath. Then, with a grunt, he brought the pickaxe down. Thwack! The point dug into the compacted soil, breaking it apart with a satisfying crunch. He swung again and again, methodically loosening the hard ground, turning it over to expose softer, darker earth. Henry watched from the pasture, his ears swiveling, a flicker of hope stirring in his weary heart. What was old John up to now? From the pasture, Henry watched, his large eyes following old John's every move. He nudged Barnaby with his nose. What do you think he's doing, Barnaby? Henry whickered, his voice still a low rumble. Barnaby, who had a good view of the stable entrance, squinted. Well, Henry, it looks to me like he's evening out the ground in there, he neighed thoughtfully, and making it softer for you by the looks of it. Daisy, trotting closer to the fence, nodded her head in agreement. Yes, she added, all that digging and raking. Must be trying to make it more comfortable for your poor feet. Woolly the sheep, who had followed them out to the pasture, let out a soft ba-ba in agreement. He's making it soft and smooth, just like a bed of fresh hay, Woolly affirmed. Just like I said, Henry, old John always finds a way. A tiny spark of hope, brighter than before, flickered in Henry's heart. Could it be? Could this strange digging and raking truly be for his aching feet? After a good while, old John finally stepped out of the stable, wiping sweat from his brow. He looked pleased with his work. He walked over to the pasture gate and, one by one, led the horses back into the stable. Barnaby and Daisy stepped in first, their hooves making soft thuds on the newly turned earth. Then it was Henry's turn. He took a hesitant step into his stall, expecting the familiar jarring pain. But instead, his hooves sank slightly into the soft, yielding ground. It felt entirely different, like walking on a thick bed of moss after years on rough stones. A wave of profound relief washed over him. He lowered his head, pressing his nose into the surprisingly comfortable earth. Old John watched him closely, a small smile playing on his lips. He reached over the stall door and patted Henry gently on the neck. "Well, Henry," he said, his voice soft with anticipation, "how does that feel?" Henry let out a soft neigh-neigh, a sound that, if old John could truly understand horse talk, would have been a contented sigh of, "Oh, this is wonderful. I like this." Old John's smile widened. He had a good feeling Henry was satisfied with the new, soft earth beneath his feet. He gave Henry one last affectionate pat, then turned to address all the animals in the stable. "Well, boys and girls," he announced, his voice cheerful, "no work today. You all just relax and enjoy the soft ground. We'll see you in the morning." With that, old John chuckled to himself and headed out, leaving the horses to explore the new comfort of their stalls. Henry, for the first time in a long while, felt a glimmer of peace in his tired hooves. The next morning, the first hint of sunlight was just touching the tops of the trees when old John came out to the stable. He greeted Henry with a cheerful "Good morning, old boy," and began to prepare Henry for work, carefully setting up the harnesses and straps for the plow. Henry felt a fresh sense of optimism. His hooves, after a night on the softened earth, felt surprisingly good light even. Henry and old John went out to plow the field. The cool morning air was crisp and the rich smell of turned earth filled the air. Henry began his work pulling the plow with strong, steady strides. For the first few furrows he felt really great, his feet moving with a freedom they hadn't known in ages. But then, as the sun climbed higher and the ground grew firmer with each step, a familiar, unwelcome sensation began to creep back. A dull ache, then a throbbing pain, started in his hooves. Slowly, insidiously, his feet started hurting again. Henry gritted his teeth and pushed through the pain. He focused on old John's steady hand on the plow, on the scent of the soil, on the rhythm of his breathing. He worked as hard as he could, but each step sent a jolt up his legs, and he was in a lot of pain. Just then, Wooly the old sheep ambled by the edge of the field, looking for a patch of clover. He noticed Henry's labored breathing and the subtle flinch with every step. "Oh, Wooly," Henry whickered, his voice a strained whisper, "I'm in so much pain I don't know what to do. I don't want to disappoint old John." Wooly stopped, looking up at the struggling horse with his gentle, knowing eyes. "Just stand there, Henry," the sheep advised softly. "Do nothing. Old John will understand that you have a problem. He'll see it." Henry took Wooly's advice. He stopped dead in the middle of a furrow, his powerful body tensing, and simply refused to move forward. He planted his aching hooves and stood still, breathing heavily. Old John, holding the handles of the plow, noticed the sudden halt. He tugged gently. "What's the matter, old boy?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. "Why did you stop?" Henry tried to take a step forward, a monumental effort for his pain-racked hooves, but his leg trembled, and he barely managed to lift his foot an inch before setting it back down. A low whimper escaped him, a sound filled with frustration and deep discomfort. Old John's kind eyes softened as he watched Henry struggle. He reached out and patted Henry gently on his powerful shoulder, a silent acknowledgment of the horse's distress. "It looks like it's time to call it a day for you, old boy," he said, his voice laced with concern. He began to unhitch the plow, already thinking of what he could try next for his faithful Henry. After unhitching Henry from the plow, old John led him carefully back to the stable. He secured his beloved horse in the stall with the newly softened earth, giving him a gentle pat. Then, with a determined sigh, he went to fetch Barnaby to finish the plowing. Barnaby was a carriage horse and wasn't used to such hard labor, though he wasn't as strong as Henry, and it did take a bit longer than Henry normally would have taken. He hung in there for the sake of old John and Henry. It took the rest of the day, but old John and Barnaby worked steadily until the plowing was done. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, old John finally unharnessed Barnaby and led him back to the stable. He made sure all the animals were settled for the night. Only then did old John walk towards his farmhouse. Standing on the porch, he called out to his wife, Martha, "I'm going over to see Jed to discuss Henry's foot problem." Martha waved goodbye to old John from the porch, and then, instead of going inside, she started heading directly towards the stables. She had a thoughtful look on her face, the kind that meant she was turning something over in her mind. When she got to the stables, she went straight to Henry's stall. "Hello there, Henry," she murmured, her voice calm and soothing. She unlatched his stall door and gently led him out into the hall where the light was better. "Let's take a look at those feet of yours," she told him, her voice gentle as she knelt down. Martha carefully lifted one of Henry's hooves. She examined it closely, turning it this way and that. Then she lifted another and another, her expression growing more focused with each one. Suddenly a wide smile spread across her face, and her eyes lit up. "Oh, I see the problem," she exclaimed, her voice filled with happy surprise. "I see the problem now." Martha headed back to the house, a determined bounce in her step, the secret of Henry's foot problem now clear in her mind. Moments later she returned, carrying something very interesting tucked carefully in her arms. She headed straight for the stables. When old John arrived at Jed's farm, Jed was standing on his porch. He gave a wave to old John as he came down the steps. "Hello, John," he said as he climbed in old John's truck and sat on the old worn seat. As they headed back to old John's farm, old John explained how he had tried many different strategies to help Henry with his sore feet. "Don't worry, John," Jed said, seeing the worried look on his friend's face. "I'm sure we'll figure it out." As they pulled up to old John's farm, past the big gates and up towards the stables, old John noticed that the light was on in the stables. He pulled up and parked his truck. Before the two exited the truck, old John saw something that confused him. There sat Martha, just outside the stables on an old bench. Just off to the side was Barnaby and the other horses, including Henry. They were all running around and looking very happy. "How do you feel?" Barnaby asked Henry. "Oh, this is wonderful," he said as he bounced back and forth. Old John and Jed exited the truck and went to Martha. Old John had a confused look on his face as he asked his loving wife, "How is this possible?" He walked over to Henry, patted him on the shoulder. "How you doing, Henry?" Henry nodded his head up and down quickly and shook it from side to side in a very happy, playful way. "Nay, nay, nay," Henry responded. Old John knew that this was Henry's way of saying, "Oh, I feel great." He turned to Martha. "What happened? How can this be?" Martha answered with a knowing smile. "It wasn't his shoes hurting his feet. Look there," she said, pointing at Henry's legs. "His socks." Old John looked at Martha with a confused look on his face. "His socks," he said, scratching his head. "I don't understand." Martha smiled at old John and once again pointed at Henry's legs. "Yes," she said, "his socks. His shoes were just fine. It was his socks. They were too tight." Woolly the old sheep, who had come back to observe the commotion, let out a thoughtful baa. "That was interesting." Woolly murmured, "Who would have thought—" The end.